Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're the deep dive designed to cut through all the noise. We take dense critical sources, pull out the essential insights, and give you the context and analysis you need to really get a handle on some key theological concepts.
Today we're going to be focusing on a single Hebrew root that I think gets at a fundamental human experience, and that is the instinct to seek protection.
Right.
Just think for a moment about a time of sudden danger or exposure, a storm, maybe an adversary, a moment of just real uncertainty. Where is your first automatic impulse to go?
We all have that internal wiring. We look for shelter. And what makes this particular study so interesting is seeing how that very basic physical act of hiding gets transformed into a theological attitude of reliance. That shift is really the core of today's deep dive.
It is. Our mission today is to track the life of the Hebrew root. That's ḥāsāh. We'll look at its main verbal uses and also its derived nouns, maḥseh and ḥāsût. The goal isn't just to define a word, it's to follow its conceptual path. So from a literal hiding place, all the way to a theological declaration of confidence that we find all through the Old Testament, but with a special focus on its concentration in the Psalms.
Which is the prayer book of Israel, so that's significant.
It is.
And our source material for this is very specific. It's primarily lexical and theological entries that are kind of like linguistic blueprints. They track the usage, the etymology, the distribution, and the theological weight this concept carries. We're going right into the DNA of the word to see the identity it creates for the righteous.
So let's start at the very beginning with this idea of shelter, the fundamental act of hiding.
When we look at the linguistic starting point for Ḥāsāh, what's so interesting is how immediate and, universal the core idea is. What does the etymology tell us about the word's original job?
Well, the core original meaning is strikingly simple. It's visual. It just means to cover or hide oneself.
Okay.
It speaks to a primal reaction to a threat. You run for immediate concealment. This isn't philosophical at all. It's purely physical.
And we can actually verify that primal physical meaning by looking at related languages, can't we?
We can, absolutely. Tracing the root through cognates, through related words in other Semitic languages, it confirms that this physical sense came long before the theological one.
For instance.
Well, in Akkadian, for example, we find the word isu, which means to cover or hide.
Right.
And likewise, in the Ethiopic language, you have esawa, which again means to cover, hide. This consistency, it just establishes that the basic act of seeking ḥāsāh is about finding concealment and safety from an external, tangible threat.
It's the action of a creature running for cover when it senses danger.
That's it.
That really sets up the groundwork. Now, the primary verbal form we find this idea in is the qual stem, the simple action form. The sources note that this verb occurs 37 times in the Old Testament. Why is the fact that it's in the qual form so instructive? Why not say the hithpale, which would suggest more of a reflexive or a continuous state?
That's a really sharp linguistic point. The qual form puts the weight on the immediacy of it. The simple, direct action of fleeing for protection.
I see.
It's not about some complex, ongoing process, which a hithpale might suggest, or even a very intensive action. It captures that essential, quick, maybe life-saving decision to turn away from danger and go toward safety. So ḥāsāh in the qual is defined as to flee for protection or to go to a place where one will find safety, rest, or comfort. It describes a swift, purposeful movement away from peril.
And we also noted the severe concentration of this word. You said 25 of those 37 qual occurrences are right there in the book of Psalms.
And that frequency is our first major clue. If nearly 3/4 of its usage is concentrated in the worship literature of Israel, it tells us that a word that started its life as a literal physical action has been, taken and standardized as a spiritual declaration within the cultic life of Israel.
So it became a core vocabulary word for prayers of lament, for petitions, and for declarations of confidence.
That's it. But before we jump all the way into the theological side, we need to spend some time on the literal examples because they show that the act itself is morally neutral. It's the choice of the object of your refuge that determines whether it's good or bad.
Okay, so let's look at those foundational examples. The action of seeking shelter side can be directed toward worldly, temporary things.
It can. Judges 9.15 gives us one of the clearest physical applications. This is during the chaos after Gideon when his son Abimelech is trying to establish his rule. It's a period of just violent instability.
And Jotham tells the parable of the trees seeking a king.
He does. The trees are looking for a king and they approach the bramble. And the bramble says, "If you truly anoint me as king over you, come Fisu, come take refuge in my shade."
Ḥāsū. That's the imperative form, the command form of the call verb.
It is. And the refuge they're seeking is purely physical, the shade of a tree, a simple agricultural image of protection. But the point is, Jotham is using this image ironically. A bramble offers terrible shade.
Right, it's all thorns.
All thorns, and it's volatile. It could burst into fire, which is what it threatens to do. So the literal act of ḥāsāh is shown to be insufficient, even dangerous, when the object you run to, in this case the bramble, is untrustworthy.
So we move from agricultural shade, which is a bad idea, to political shade, which carries immediate negative consequences.
And that's even worse. Isaiah 30.2 gives us the key example of a misdirected ḥāsāh. The prophet condemns the people for going down to Egypt without seeking the Lord's counsel.
And he says they do it to Susat, to seek refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to hide in the shadow of Egypt.
So that highlights what we were saying. The movement itself, fleeing for cover, isn't inherently wrong, but the destination they choose is idolatrous and, in the end, useless.
Well, it's worse than useless, isn't it? It's treacherous. The reliance they place on Egypt is declared a shame and a disgrace in the very next verse.
It is. The sources really bring out this contrast. God's protection is effective, Egypt's is deceitful, and it will fail. This critical pre-theological application sets the stage perfectly. If you instinctively seek refuge, you must choose the right object, because the wrong one, like the bramble or like Egypt, it could destroy you.
That context makes the later theological shift much, much clearer. Now, let's briefly bring in the noun forms that are derived from this action. maḥseh and ḥāsût.
These nouns describe the tangible and the abstract results of the action of ḥāsāh. maḥseh is the most common one. Its meaning is very direct. Refuge or shelter. It's the actual place or the entity that provides the cover. It occurs 20 times.
And the other one? The suit.
That one's much rarer. It only occurs once, and it refers to the more abstract idea of refuge or confidence. We'll look at its specific context later on because it's directly tied to this idea of false security.
Okay. And before we leave this section on the literal roots, there's the fact that this concept moved beyond just literature and into personal identity. I'm talking about the names.
Right. The integration into personal names, it signals that the idea wasn't just abstract theology. It was a lived reality for people, a confession of belief. So we find names like Ḥāsāh, which just means refuge, and it was used for a Levite doorkeeper.
And there's an even clearer one.
There is. maḥseh, which means Yahweh is a refuge. We see it used for the grandfather of one of Jeremiah's associates.
So when a parent names their child maḥseh, they're making a very open, public declaration of where their reliance lies.
It's an assertion that becomes part of that child's identity. It moves past a temporary action or a piece of architecture, and it solidifies it as a fundamental belief about God's character.
Before the child could even speak.
Before the child could speak. This groundwork of literal hiding and personal confession, it prepares us perfectly for where the word goes next, its primary theological usage.
The narrative arc that we've been tracing, from finding shade under a tree to finding political vulnerability under Egypt, it shows this progressive failure of earthly refuges. And that naturally pushes the seeker toward the only reliable alternative.
Let's talk about that moment of transition to the divine object of the ḥāsāh.
The transition isn't just natural, it's mandated by revelation. Deuteronomy 32.37 gives us the sharpest theological contrast. The Lord is speaking, and he asks, "Where are their gods, the rock in whom they sought refuge?" It's a condemnation of idolatry, a declaration that any refuge sought outside of Yahweh is ultimately powerless.
Right. This critique is key. It establishes that the act of seeking shelter isn't exclusive to Yahweh, but the effective act of finding shelter is.
The goal, then, is to correct the misdirection that we saw in Judges and Isaiah.
It is, and the concentration of the word's usage confirms that correction. Overwhelmingly, God is the one in whom the righteous seek ḥāsāh. We see this confirmed in historical retrospect and in covenant declaration. Look at David reflecting on his deliverance in 2 Samuel 22, a text that's echoed in Psalm 18. He declares, "My God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge."
That verse is not just a definition, it's an overflowing catalog of protective metaphors.
Yeah.
How does the imagery of the shield expand the idea of refuge beyond just a static defense?
That's a great question. The sources repeatedly highlight the shield metaphor. God is described as being a shield to all who seek refuge in him. We see it in Samuel 22, again in Psalm 18, and it's even quoted again in Proverbs 30.
A fortress, a maze is static, it's a wall you run behind.
It is. But a shield is active and dynamic. It moves with the defender, it deflects immediate threats. So this depiction shows God's protection isn't a passive isolation, but an active engagement in the defense of the usim, those who seek his cover.
Now, the sources draw very specific attention to a core feature of the Psalms, and that's this recurring confessional formula. It's an immediate, first-person declaration of dependence.
This is one of the most distinctive features of the word in its liturgical context. It's the formula, bekathasiti. Literally, in you I have hidden, or in you I have taken refuge, Yahweh.
And when we translate that into modern thought, it often becomes something like, I entrust myself to you.
It does, and the use of the perfect tense here, asiti, is significant. It suggests a settled state that began in the past and continues right into the present. It's a completed action that carries present implications.
So it's not just a hope for the future, it's a declaration of a decision that's already been made and is currently being relied upon.
That's it. It's a declaration of absolute chosen dependence. The person praying is facing stress, opposition, danger, the typical setting of the lament psalms, and they are intentionally redirecting their reliance.
And we see this formula again and again.
Over and over. Psalms 7, 11, 16, 25, 31, 57, 71, and others. The frequency of it institutionalized this posture of reliance within Israel's covenant worship. It defines the posture of faith, recognizing one's own vulnerability and actively relocating confidence to the divine.
The discussion of the sources also points out that this feeling, this posture of ECD, runs parallel to other theological terms of confidence.
It often does. It often parallels bikabati, which means I trust in you. This linkage clarifies a really critical spiritual insight. Seeking refuge is not just a physical search for a safe zone. It's fundamentally an internal attitude of reliance and faith.
If you seek ḥāsāh in Yahweh, you are at the same time making an act of baith, of trust, in his ability and his character to actually save you. This brings up a point that needs some nuance based on the source analysis. Proverbs 14.32 is often translated to say that the righteous confides in God, but some translations suggest the righteous finds refuge in his own integrity, in his brutumo. Now, if the text suggests refuge can be found in integrity, doesn't that threaten the singularity of Yahweh as the only refuge? How do the sources help us reconcile that reading?
That is a sharp observation, and it's a necessary challenge to address, especially within a Reformed framework where reliance is solely on the divine.
Right.
The consensus among the lexical sources favors translating bruthom not as the object of the refuge, but as the condition or the context in which the refuge is found. The verse reads something like, the wicked is thrust down by his evil, but the righteous sesheh takes refuge in his death.
Okay, so the action of seeking refuge is performed by the righteous person, and that person's character is defined by integrity.
Precisely. The righteous person is defined by their adherence to tuma, to integrity. And that moral posture is what positions them to seek refuge in God, particularly when facing death, the ultimate exposure. It shows that this confidence covers the most vulnerable moments of life, even when everything else, physical strength, earthly wealth, life itself, is failing.
It makes the concept existential. It applies at the moment of passing, where only reliance on the Creator can provide security.
It does.
So the integrity of the believer is the qualification for the confidence, but Yahweh remains the object of that confidence, even in the face of death. That clarification is vital. It prevents any suggestion that the righteous might be relying on their own self-merit for protection.
It maintains the theological distinction perfectly. The ultimate security of the Ishe is guaranteed into eternity because the object of their refuge is eternal and utterly reliable.
As we move from that internal attitude of reliance to the external visual language, the poetic imagery that's used with ḥāsāh is, well, it's incredibly evocative. The most famous one is the metaphor of the wings. What does it mean when the worshiper asks to take refuge in the shadow of thy wings?
This imagery is both personal and structural at the same time. We read of seeking refuge in the shadow of thy wings, that's Betzel Kanpeka in Psalm 36 and Psalm 57, or specifically under his wings in Psalm 91 and Ruth 2. The image is tender. It immediately calls to mind a bird sheltering its young. It provides intimate, nurturing protection from heat or cold or predators.
That analogy of the mother bird is easy to grasp. But the sources suggest this imagery is often rooted in something much more specific than just generalized poetry. It seems to be tethered to the cultic site itself.
This is a critical insight that comes from the theological analysis. While the language is beautiful poetry, the reference to wings often points directly to the physical place where God's presence was symbolized, the sanctuary or the temple.
So
Specifically, this imagery likely references the huge wings of the cherubim that stretched over the Ark of the Covenant, covering the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies.
So seeking refuge under the wings was an appropriation of the physical security and the covenantal presence associated with the temple structure itself. When David, maybe in exile or in distress, writes in Psalm 57, "In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge," he's spiritually locating himself back at the heart of covenant life, even if he's physically separated from the sanctuary.
That's it. It connects the action of the individual to the collective life of worship. It establishes the physical sanctuary as the visual proxy for the comprehensive safety that only Yahweh provides. And this brings us to the designation of the community itself, the ochim.
The active participle form, uchim, it means those seeking refuge, and it's used descriptively. This moves the concept from a temporary action to a definition of identity.
That's right. The individual confession, wusidī, it moves outward to define the entire worshiping community. The ochim are the people of God defined by their posture of continuous reliance.
And the sources highlight that the tosim are frequently grouped in parallel with other defining characteristics of the faithful.
They are, and it's very telling to see what those other characteristics are.
So how does seeking refuge compare to these other defining traits?
Well, look at the grouping. The Tisim are put alongside those who fear Yahweh. They're next to those who love his name and his servants.
Okay, so fearing Yahweh, the Yarrow, that relates to reverence and moral conduct.
Right. And loving his name relates to covenant affection and obedience. Seeking refuge, tissa, that relates to radical dependence and the placement of security.
The act of seeking refuge, then, isn't secondary to piety. It is the necessary active posture that defines piety itself. It's the recognition that you are vulnerable and you have to constantly rely on a source outside of yourself.
Absolutely. This collective declaration elevates Sissa from just a situational response to a foundational state of blessedness. And this descriptive use often appears in Beatitudes blessings pronounced upon the righteous.
You see that in Psalms 2 and 5 and Zephaniah 3. They all contain blessings for those who take refuge in Yahweh.
They do. So being counted among the Suv becomes synonymous with belonging to the true covenant community.
So we have this potential for physical asylum running to the temple. But the liturgical usage shifts the emphasis. Does this mean the concept loses its connection to physical safety entirely?
The sources are clear that the physical idea is the root, but the emphasis definitely shifts. The commentators note that while Ḥāsāh can describe finding actual asylum, particularly at a sanctuary, its frequent liturgical use means it equally, if not primarily, describes the inner attitude of the praying community.
So if we insisted it only meant literal asylum, would be divorcing the Psalms from their regular use in prayer and confession.
We would. When the psalmist sings or prays, "I seek refuge," they are adopting the spiritual posture that the physical sanctuary represented: security, provision, and covenant presence. And they're applying it to their present circumstances, whether they're in the city or out in the wilderness.
That's the deep insight. The worshiper is appropriating the covenant experience of previous generations. Their place of safety becomes not a location, but the Lord himself, accessed through the intentional declaration of reliance.
Which makes Ḥāsāh a comprehensive theological concept. The righteous person is one who consciously flees earthly vulnerability and chooses divine, personalized protection.
Let's transition now to the related noun form, maḥseh. This noun, occurring 20 times, describes the physical or conceptual place of safety. While the verb is the dynamic act, maḥseh is the sturdy result.
That's a great way to put it. Maḥseh grounds the concept in tangibility, even when it's applied to God. We see its literal uses demonstrating its primary function, protection from the environment. Isaiah 4.6 describes maḥseh as a physical shelter from rain and storm.
And Isaiah 25 reiterates that same function against the deluge. It is the architectural element of security.
It is. And Psalm 104.188 provides another literal yet very illustrative image. It says that rocks serve as a maḥseh for conies.
Rock badgers, essentially.
Right. Small, vulnerable creatures. They find their safety not in their own strength, but in locating themselves within the reliable structure of the natural rock formation. This just reinforces that the core function is defense against environmental or external threats for the inherently vulnerable.
But when Yahweh is the Mesa, the concept is elevated far beyond just simple shade or a natural rock formation.
The context expands dramatically. Mesa is used interchangeably with other very robust concepts of security. It's employed as a synonym for mawos, which means refuge or stronghold, and mshub, meaning fortress.
So these synonyms paint God not as a flimsy covering, but as an impenetrable, prepared fortification.
He's not just a temporary solution, he is a military-grade defense system for his people. The declaration of God as the maḥseh becomes a powerful rhetorical tool of assurance in times of communal or individual distress.
It's a core feature of the Psalms of confidence. God is a refuge and strength, from Psalm 46.
It is. We see it in Psalms 46, 61, 62, 71. And we noted Jeremiah's personal affirmation, maḥseh, my refuge, in Jeremiah 17:17. These declarations are intended to actively generate confidence in the listener. If God is my stronghold, I don't need to fear the storm.
Now we come to what might be the most pointed part of the source material, the warning against choosing a counterfeit refuge. This involves that abstract noun ḥāsût and the highly charged phrase maḥseh.
That abstract noun ḥāsût, meaning refuge or confidence, it occurs only once in Isaiah 30:3, and it's specifically referencing the confidence the people placed in the protection of Egypt.
So the context immediately links ḥāsût not just to safety, but to the reliability of the chosen object.
It does, and if the object is unreliable, the confidence is false. This brings us to Isaiah 28, where the prophet directly attacks the false security in Jerusalem. What exactly is this refuge of falsehood that he's condemning here?
Well, Isaiah 28 targets the political and spiritual leadership of Jerusalem. He calls them scoffers.
He does. And they had created a covenant, most likely a treaty with a foreign power or perhaps a spiritual complacency that just ignored God's law, and they were relying on human deceit to avoid the impending Assyrian threat. They actually boast about it.
Right, they say, "We have made a covenant with death. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us. For we have made ḥāsāh maḥseh falsehood our refuge, and under deceit we have hid ourselves."
That is just a stunning declaration of misplaced reliance. They aren't just mistaken here, they are actively basing their security on a lie, on a ḥāsāh.
And this is where the theology of Desu becomes truly explosive. It clarifies that true refuge isn't about finding any place to hide, it's about finding the trustworthy person.
Yes. If they choose falsehood, they have only a structure built on sand, and God then declares, "I will make justice the measuring line, and righteousness the plummet, and the hail will sweep away the maḥseh, the refuge of falsehood, and the waters will overflow the hiding place."
So the ultimate judgment is the removal of the false shelter. The very thing they relied upon to save them is the first thing that judgment consumes.
It fundamentally clarifies the choice. The decision to seek ḥāsāh is a choice between the single reliable protector and a lie. Placing confidence in deceit offers no actual protection, only the illusion of it, and that illusion gets destroyed.
This contrast proves that ḥāsāh requires a valid object. Placing confidence in human strength or political schemes or outright lies is condemned because it guarantees failure under trial.
And this fits squarely within our Reformed recognition that assurance is located solely in God's character and provision, not in human arrangement or self-assurance.
It transforms the idea of finding shelter into an issue of ultimate fidelity. You reveal your loyalty by where you choose to run when the threat appears. This concept of ḥāsāh clearly defined the identity of the righteous within the Old Testament. Let's look now at how this idea extended beyond the borders of Israel and into subsequent theological and historical movements. Let's start with the Syriac connections.
This linguistic observation reveals a vital conceptual evolution. The sources point out that in Syriac, a related Aramaic dialect, the derived term āsiyah is used and commonly translated as godly or pious.
So seeking refuge in God moved from being a behavior to becoming synonymous with the entire definition of godliness itself.
That is the implication, and it represents a real theological maturation. The person whose defining characteristic is seeking refuge in God is simply the pious person. The posture of reliance on the divine ceases to be one virtue among many. It becomes the core, functional definition of the righteous life.
You are actively seeking ḥāsāh in Yahweh. You are, by definition, operating in true covenantal piety.
That's the idea.
This emphasis on piety in a defined community seems to have a direct historical linkage to one of the most famous and separate religious groups in the Second Temple period, these Essenes.
This is a powerful historical connection. The Greek terms used to describe this group, Essaioi and Essenoi, are widely believed by scholars to have been borrowed from Aramaic derivatives of this same ḥāsāh root. The name itself may well mean the pious ones or those who seek refuge.
That makes perfect sense given what we just discussed about the Essene being the descriptor for the righteous community in the Psalms. The Essenes would have been a group claiming that very title, positioning themselves as the true remnant who had separated themselves from what they saw as the corruption of the Jerusalem priesthood and temple worship.
Precisely. They were formalizing the designation of the Essim into a distinct religious movement. Their physical separation, often into desert communities like Qumran, reflected their theological stance. They were seeking refuge from the world, much like the psalmists sought refuge in God's presence, believing they were the ones actively taking shelter under God's wings.
Their separatism was a tangible expression of the ideology rooted in Ḥāsāh.
It was. It shows the concept's longevity, moving from a verb to a spiritual identity to a formalized movement. Their whole existence was, in a sense, a physical enactment of the spiritual posture we find in the Psalms.
And that contrast between physical hiding and spiritual trust is what the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, seems to focus on when translating the Ḥāsāh. How did the Greek translators choose to render this Hebrew concept? Did they keep the spatial element of hiding?
The sources indicate a really noticeable shift. The Greek equivalents most often used for ḥāsā are pepoithenai, which means to trust, and elpizine, which means to hope or to expect.
That's a significant theological choice that the translators made. They were operating in a Hellenistic context where physical sanctuary was often less prominent than the internal philosophical state.
It was. By choosing pepoithenai and elpizane, they were signaling that the spatial, physical hiding aspect of ḥāsā was secondary or maybe had faded entirely in its relevance for them.
Instead, the focus was placed squarely on the internal attitude of trust and the expectation of deliverance. The spiritual confidence became the primary meaning, leaving the physical act as the archaic root.
And this linguistic decision underscores the theological maturation of the term. For the early church and the wider diaspora community, protection was achieved not by finding a specific building or a literal shadow, but by cultivating an internal, settled reliance on the Lord's faithfulness. It fulfills that secondary sense of confidence that was inherent in the original Hebrew.
It confirms the journey of Ḥāsāh, from a literal flee for cover to a covenantal confession of confidence in the divine. This has been a true deep dive into the very DNA of reliance. We started with the basic human instinct to hide ourselves, the literal Asa under a tree, or the dangerous political Asa under Egypt. We tracked that concept as it was refined and claimed by the worshiping community, culminating in that confession, Becca Siti, I place my reliance in you.
Asa describes an active posture of the soul. It is the necessary conscious rejection of maḥseh, of false security, in favor of reliance on the singular, utterly reliable protector. It doesn't just describe what the righteous do, it defines who they are, transforming them into the Issim, the community of the reliant.
The knowledge gleaned from these sources shows us that the way we choose to flee from danger reveals the object of our ultimate defining trust. It's a real moment of truth for the soul.
And that leads us to a final thought for you to carry forward. The source material draws a strong distinction between the physical security of the sanctuary and the internal reliance on God's presence. Zephaniah 3.1 Phil states that the remnant, the Hissim, will take refuge in the name of Yahweh.
In the name.
In the name. So since the physical temple structure no longer exists, and you live a life of constant movement, uncertainty, and temptation toward false refuges, be they financial, political, or self-reliant, what does it mean for you to take refuge not in walls of stone or the shade of cherubim, but in the mere name of God? Making his revealed character, his covenantal identity, your ultimate, portable, and utterly reliable shelter is the essence of ḥāsā carried into your present life.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Reformed thinking. We trust this knowledge brings you increased clarity and understanding where your true security lies.